How medieval widows stayed warm on winter nights. The winter night has settled quietly over the medieval village. Beyond the walls of a small stone house, the fields have disappeared beneath a pale layer of frost. The paths are hard beneath the feet. The bare branches make thin sounds in the wind. And somewhere in the darkness, an animal shifts inside a nearby shelter. Inside the house, the light is low. A small fire burns near the center of the room, sending a faint orange glow across rough wooden furniture and uneven stone walls. The smoke rises slowly before finding its way toward the opening in the roof or through a small chimney, depending on the kind of house and the period. Near the fire sits a woman who has learned to measure winter differently. She is a widow. Her husband may have died only recently, or perhaps several winters have passed since his absence became part of ordinary life. Medieval widows lived in many different circumstances. Some were wealthy landowners. Some belonged to noble households. Some managed farms. Others lived in towns, worked with their hands, depended on relatives, or struggled with poverty. Their lives were not all alike. But during winter, many shared the same simple problem. Cold entered through every weakness in the house. It slipped beneath doors. It moved through cracks in walls. It gathered around windows. It came down from poorly insulated roofs and rose from cold floors. And when the fire became smaller during the night, the room could become surprisingly cold. So imagine yourself beside this woman as evening slowly deepens. There is no electric light waiting to brighten the room. There is no central heating hidden beneath the floor. There is no glass window sealed tightly against the winter wind. There is only the house, the fire, the clothing, the bedding, and the knowledge passed quietly from one generation to another. The first thing to understand is that medieval people did not think of warmth as something produced by one object. Warmth was something assembled. A person created a small world around the body. Clothing formed one layer. The walls formed another. The fire provided another. Bedding added another. Food helped provide energy. And daily habits helped preserve whatever warmth could be created. For a widow managing a household, keeping warm could therefore become a careful balance between what she had and what the winter demanded. The fire was important, but firewood was never simply free warmth. Wood had to be gathered, purchased, transported, stored, or obtained through rights to common land. In some places, people could collect fallen branches or other permitted fuel. In other circumstances, access to woodland was restricted. Every log represented effort. Every bundle of sticks represented time. And on the coldest nights, the fire had to be used wisely. During the evening, flames might be kept alive for cooking and warmth. Once the household settled for sleep, the fire could be allowed to burn lower, depending on the design of the hearth and the safety of the home. The glow might remain. The room might still hold a little heat. But the night outside would continue growing colder. As the morning slowly arrives, the woman would need to begin again. She might wake before sunrise. The air would be cold against her face. The embers would have lost much of their brightness. Perhaps a faint red glow would still remain beneath the ash. She would uncover the embers carefully and add small pieces of fuel. A little air would reach the coals. The red would become brighter. Then a tiny flame would appear. Soon, another followed. the fire had returned. This simple act was part of the rhythm of household life. The fire was not merely a source of comfort. It was part of the household itself. It cooked the food. It heated water. It helped dry damp clothing. It provided light. And in winter, it became one of the most important defenses against the cold. Yet the widow did not necessarily spend the entire night beside the flames. Her bed could provide a different kind of protection. Medieval beds varied enormously. A wealthy household might have a substantial wooden bed with curtains, mattresses, blankets, and other textiles. A poorer household might have a much simpler sleeping arrangement made from a wooden frame, a straw-filled mattress, blankets, and ordinary household cloth. The difference between these beds could be enormous, but the basic principle was similar. The goal was to create a layer of material around the body. Straw could be used as filling for mattresses and bedding. It was not luxurious, but it had a useful quality. It trapped air, and trapped air can slow the movement of heat away from the body. A mattress filled with dry plant material could therefore provide insulation between a sleeper and a cold surface. The same idea appeared in other forms of bedding. Blankets made from wool were particularly valuable. Wool has long been useful in cold climates because its fibers can trap air and retain warmth even when conditions are damp. Medieval Europe had extensive sheep farming, and wool became one of its most important materials. For many people, wool was not simply something sold by merchants. It was part of everyday survival. A woolen garment could be worn during the day. A woolen blanket could be placed over the body at night. A wool textile could be repaired repeatedly, and when carefully maintained, it could remain useful for years. Picture yourself entering the sleeping area after the fire has been reduced. The room is dark, except for the faint light from the hearth. The stone or packed earth floor feels cold. The bedding has been prepared. The woman settles down beneath several layers of cloth. The first sensation is not necessarily warmth. It may be coolness. Then the body begins doing its quiet work. Heat leaves the skin. The surrounding layers slow that loss. The trapped air inside the bedding warms. Gradually, the small space beneath the blankets becomes more comfortable. This was one of the great secrets of surviving cold nights. People did not need to make the entire room warm if they could keep the space immediately around the body warm. This distinction matters. Modern homes are often heated as whole environments. A medieval household could be much more focused on the person. The fire warmed the room near it. The clothing warmed the body. The bedding warmed the sleeping space. And curtains, shutters, doors, walls, and other barriers reduced the movement of cold air. A wealthy widow might have had access to textiles that a poor widow could never afford. This difference could shape the experience of winter. A noble widow living in a stone manor might have servants carrying fuel, preparing fires, arranging bedding, and bringing hot food. She might possess thick woolen blankets and a bed enclosed by curtains. A widow living in a small rural household might have needed to gather fuel herself. She might mend her own clothing. She might sleep in the same room as other members of the household. She might share warmth simply because several people occupied the same small space. Medieval households were often more crowded than the modern imagination suggests. Privacy was limited. sleeping arrangements could involve several people: children, relatives, servants, or other household members might sleep in nearby spaces. This was not necessarily considered strange. The household was a social and economic unit, and the rooms were often designed around practical needs rather than individual privacy. In winter, this arrangement had another consequence. People could share body warmth. A room occupied by several people lost heat more slowly than an empty room. The sleeping area itself could become warmer. The presence of another person beneath the same blanket could make the cold easier to bear. For a widow who had recently lost her husband, this could carry an emotional meaning as well. The empty space beside her might be colder than the physical room. Winter could make absence feel especially noticeable. The sound of the wind outside might continue. The fire might crack softly, and the familiar movements of another person might no longer be there. But medieval widows were not simply passive figures waiting for winter to end. Many managed property. Some inherited rights. Some ran businesses. Some supervised servants. Some worked in crafts and trade. Some farmed. Some remarried. Some remained unmarried. The legal and economic position of a widow depended greatly on her location, social status, marriage arrangements, and period. This matters because warmth was partly a question of resources. A widow with property had more choices. A widow without resources had fewer. In many medieval societies, women could possess or control property under certain legal circumstances, and widowhood could sometimes provide a degree of independence that married women had not previously experienced. Yet independence did not automatically mean comfort. A widow still had to face winter. She still needed fuel. She still needed food. She still needed clothing. And she still had to decide how limited resources should be used. Fuel was especially important. Wood was not the only possible source. Different regions used different fuels according to local landscapes and availability. Peat could be used in some areas. Charcoal was important for particular purposes, especially where higher temperatures were needed for crafts. Other plant materials could also serve as fuel. In some households, dried materials from agriculture could contribute to the household fuel supply. The exact combination depended on geography. A village near extensive woodland had different possibilities from a town where wood had to be purchased. A household in northern Europe experienced winter differently from one farther south. A stone building in a town differed from a timber house in the countryside. There was no single medieval winter. There were thousands of local winters, and there were thousands of ways of coping with them. Still, certain principles appeared again and again. Keep the body covered. Keep the sleeping area insulated. Keep drafts under control. Use fuel carefully. Eat enough when food is available. Stay near other people, and make the most of whatever shelter the household could provide. The medieval house itself was part of the solution. Walls could be thick. Roofs could be heavily thatched. Timber frames could be packed or plastered. Windows could be small. Shutters could be closed. Curtains could cover openings. None of these methods made a building perfectly warm. But perfection was not necessary. Even a small reduction in cold airflow could make a difference. A thick thatched roof, for example, could provide significant insulation compared with a completely exposed roof. The walls could also slow the movement of heat. The hearth created warmth. The surrounding structure helped hold some of it. The room gradually became a sheltered pocket within the larger winter landscape. Imagine standing outside for a moment. The night air is sharp. The sky is dark. The fields are silent. Your breath is visible. Then you approach the house. From outside, it may appear almost completely dark, but through a small opening, perhaps a shutter that has not been fully closed, a faint orange glow can be seen. Inside, the atmosphere is different. It is still cold, but it is sheltered. There is the smell of smoke. There may be the scent of cooked grain, onions, cabbage, or another food prepared earlier in the evening. Wet clothing may be drying near the fire. The wooden surfaces feel cool. The bedding waits in the darker part of the room. The contrast between outside and inside is not dramatic. It is subtle, and that subtle difference could mean everything. A medieval person did not need a warm room by modern standards. They needed a room that was warmer than the night outside. That was enough to begin with. The same principle applied to clothing. Layering was useful because each layer created another barrier between skin and cold air. A person might wear a linen garment close to the body. Over it could be woolen clothing. Depending on status and occupation, there could be additional outer garments. Cloaks were especially useful because they could wrap around the body and provide protection when moving between buildings. For a widow, clothing was valuable property. Textiles were expensive. They required labor. Spinning fibers into yarn took time. Weaving cloth took time. Dyeing could require additional materials and labor. Making a garment required cutting and sewing. Repairing it extended its useful life. So clothing was not casually discarded. A worn garment could be patched. A torn section could be repaired. An old piece of cloth could be reused. A household might carefully maintain every useful textile because winter had a way of revealing the value of each one. The same was true of blankets. A blanket was not simply decoration. It was a barrier against heat loss. If one blanket was not enough, another could be placed above it. A heavy textile could be particularly useful. The weight itself might create a comforting sense of enclosure. The sleeping body gradually warmed the space beneath it, and the blanket prevented some of that warmth from escaping too quickly. There is something very quiet about this process. No machinery is running. No thermostat is being adjusted. No display shows the temperature. The body simply lies beneath cloth while the night moves slowly around the house. Outside, the wind continues. Inside, breathing becomes steady. The fire gives an occasional soft crack. The house settles, and the long winter night continues. For a widow, another important source of warmth could be food. Food did not heat the room in the same way as a fire, but it supplied the body with energy. Winter diets varied widely by region and social class. Stored grains were important. Legumes could provide nourishment. Root vegetables and other preserved foods could survive the colder months. Cabbage and other vegetables could be stored or preserved in various ways. Meat, where available, might be salted, dried, smoked, or otherwise preserved. Fish was important in many regions. Dairy products could also play a role. The exact winter meal depended on what the household had stored, what could be purchased, and what local customs allowed. A wealthy household might have a far greater range of food than a poor one. But the general rhythm remained. Summer and autumn were seasons of preparation. Winter was a season of consumption. The stores gathered earlier now became the household's protection. Grain became bread or porridge. Dried food became part of a stew. Salted meat could be added when available. A pot could simmer near the fire. The warmth from cooking helped slightly heat the surrounding air, while the meal itself provided energy. The woman might sit near the hearth while eating. The room would smell of smoke and food. Outside, darkness would remain, but inside, the household would be alive. This was one reason the hearth became such an important center of medieval domestic life. It was not simply a fireplace in the modern sense. It was a working place. Cooking happened there. Food was prepared. Water could be heated. People gathered around it. Tools might be repaired nearby. Clothing could be dried. Conversation happened beside it. Stories could be told there. And during winter, the hearth marked the warmest part of the home. A widow who managed her household would have understood this instinctively. The best place for certain tasks was near the fire. The dampest clothing belonged nearby. Food preparation belonged there. People who were cold gathered close. But the fire itself had dangers. Open flames could ignite thatch, wooden structures, cloth, and other materials. Medieval towns sometimes suffered devastating fires because buildings were closely packed, and many structures contained combustible materials. For that reason, maintaining a fire required care. The warmth that protected a household could also threaten it. A careful balance was needed. The fire could not simply be made enormous. It had to be controlled. This is another reason medieval warmth was an art of moderation. Too little fire meant cold. Too much fire could mean danger. Too much smoke could make breathing uncomfortable. Too little ventilation could fill the room with smoke. The household therefore had to live within the limits of its technology. The medieval widow was not fighting winter with one perfect invention. She was using dozens of small solutions. A shutter, a blanket, a woolen cloak, a straw mattress, a thick wall, a carefully managed fire, a warm meal, a shared sleeping space, a pair of dry shoes, a repaired roof, a curtain, a pile of fuel. Each one was modest. Together, they created shelter. And perhaps this is the most useful way to understand medieval winter. Survival did not usually depend upon one extraordinary object. It depended upon accumulation. A little warmth here, a little protection there, a little preparation before the cold arrived. The widow's winter might therefore begin long before the first snow. In autumn, fuel would need to be gathered or purchased. Food stores would need to be checked. Roofing would need attention. Clothing might need repairs. Bedding could be aired and cleaned when conditions allowed. The household might prepare for shorter days and longer nights. Preparation was itself a form of warmth. A person who entered winter with dry fuel, adequate clothing, sound shelter, and stored food had a very different experience from someone who entered it without those things. For widows with limited resources, preparation could be especially important. A broken roof during summer was inconvenient. A broken roof during a freezing winter night could become dangerous. A shortage of fuel was uncomfortable. A shortage during a prolonged cold spell could be much more serious. So the household economy was closely connected to physical comfort. Every useful resource mattered. Every repair had value. Every stored bundle of fuel represented a future evening when the fire could continue burning. The widow might know exactly how much wood remained. She might notice which pieces burned quickly and which lasted longer. She might save certain fuel for cooking. She might use smaller pieces to revive embers. She might avoid wasting a good log during the afternoon if the night promised to be colder. These decisions rarely appear in grand historical chronicles. Kings and battles occupy much of written history, but ordinary winter life was shaped by decisions like these. A woman placing another log on the hearth was participating in history just as surely as a ruler signing a charter. Her world was smaller, her concerns were immediate, but they were real. And if we remain quietly in that house, we begin to notice how much knowledge was contained in ordinary actions. She knows where the cold enters. She knows which blanket is thickest. She knows which corner of the room stays warmest. She knows which clothing is still damp. She knows how much fuel remains. She knows when the embers need attention. She knows how the weather has changed. This knowledge may never have been written down. It was practical knowledge. It lived in habits. It moved from mother to daughter, from neighbor to neighbor, from one generation to another. And winter taught people to pay attention. A change in the wind, a sudden drop in temperature, a roof that began to leak, a stack of fuel that seemed smaller than expected, a child who was unusually cold, a blanket that had become thin. Small signs could matter. For the widow, household management was therefore closely connected to care. If she had children, their warmth would be part of her responsibilities. If she lived with older relatives, their comfort might require additional attention. If servants or workers were part of the household, their clothing and sleeping arrangements mattered too. If she lived alone, she had fewer people to help with physical work. That could make winter more demanding. Yet living alone could also mean that she controlled the small household according to her own habits. The medieval experience of widowhood was not one simple story. Some women had security. Others had uncertainty. Some had supportive families. Others faced difficult relationships with relatives or communities. Some owned property. Others depended upon charity or labor. And winter exposed these differences. The warmth of a noble widow's chamber could be very different from the warmth of a poor widow's room, but both would still understand the same cold. The same winter wind could move across a manor roof and a village cottage. The same darkness could stretch from evening toward morning. The same human body would need protection. And that is where the story becomes quieter still. Because eventually, after the work of the evening is finished, there is little left to do. The pot has been moved away from the strongest heat. The tools have been put aside. The door has been closed. The shutters are secured. The fire has been reduced. The household becomes still. The widow settles beneath her bedding. Perhaps she wears a woolen garment to sleep. Perhaps she keeps a cloth around her head. Perhaps another blanket has been folded over her. The exact arrangement would depend upon her circumstances and local customs. There is no universal medieval sleeping costume. There is no single medieval bed. There is no single medieval house, but there is the same human desire to remain warm. The night grows deeper. The fire makes a faint sound. A piece of wood collapses into glowing embers. The room darkens. The cold presses gently against the walls, but beneath the blankets, a small pocket of warmth remains. Her breathing becomes slow. The bedding rises and falls. The winter night continues outside. And for a while, nothing needs to happen. This is perhaps the most peaceful part of the medieval winter. Not because the cold has disappeared. It has not. Not because the house has become comfortable by modern standards. It is not. But because the household has reached its nighttime rhythm. The fire is controlled. The doors are closed. The bedding is in place. The body is sheltered. The long night can pass, and somewhere beyond the walls, snow may begin to fall. It lands silently on the roof. One flake disappears into another. The fields become whiter. The branches hold a thin layer of frost. The village sleeps. Inside the house, the widow sleeps too. For a few hours, the world asks nothing of her. Then, slowly, the night begins to move toward morning. The embers dim. The darkness becomes slightly less complete. The coldest part of the night may have passed, and before long, another small sound will begin. A breath, a movement, the rustle of bedding. Then the woman will open her eyes. The winter morning is waiting. She will rise into the cold air. She will reach toward the hearth, and the quiet work of creating warmth will begin again. The story of medieval winter is therefore not simply a story of cold. It is a story of repetition. Every evening, warmth was created. Every night, it was protected. Every morning, it had to be created again. The widow's survival depended not on defeating winter, but on living carefully within it. And as the morning slowly arrives, the first faint light begins to enter the room. The fire is waiting beneath the ash. The house is quiet. The blankets are folded back, and another winter day begins. The world outside is still cold, but inside, a small ember remains, and that ember is enough to begin with. As the morning slowly arrives, the widow bends toward the hearth once more. She moves the ash aside. A dull red point appears. She pauses, then gently feeds it. A thin flame rises, and with that small flame, the house begins to wake. The first warmth touches the nearby stones. A kettle may be placed close to the fire. A pot may soon follow. Clothing that was left near the hearth during the night can be checked. A damp sleeve may be turned toward the heat. A pair of shoes may be moved closer. None of these actions is dramatic. They are ordinary. Yet ordinary actions are often what allow a difficult season to become manageable. The widow may have learned to organize the room around the fire. The warmest place belongs to tasks that require heat. The drier side of the hearth is useful for clothing. The darker corners can hold stored objects. The sleeping area remains away from the direct flames. In a small house, every part of the room has a purpose. Space is precious. Warmth is precious. Fuel is precious. Time is precious. And the woman has to use all four carefully. If there is snow outside, she may need to clear a path. If the roof has collected moisture, she may watch for leaks. If the wind has changed, she may check a shutter. If the firewood has become low, she must think about the next supply. Winter never completely leaves the mind. It remains somewhere in the background, like the cold air beyond the door. For a wealthy widow, servants might handle many of these tasks. She might remain in a larger chamber, where curtains and thick textiles created a more protected environment. In elite households, beds could be enclosed by curtains that helped reduce drafts. A curtained bed was not simply an object of status. It could create a smaller enclosed space around the sleeper. The fabric could limit air movement. The sleeping area could feel more private. And in a cold room, that privacy could also be practical. The curtain became another layer. Wooden bed frames lifted the sleeper away from the coldest floor. Mattresses provided another insulating layer. Blankets added more. Nightclothes added another. The result was a small protected environment inside a much larger building. This is a pattern that appears repeatedly in human history. When people cannot heat an entire environment, they reduce the size of the environment they need to keep warm. A tent becomes a shelter. A cloak wraps around the body. A blanket surrounds the sleeper. A curtained bed creates a room within a room. The medieval world was full of these small solutions. And for widows, these solutions were shaped by what they could afford. A rich widow might possess several blankets. A poor widow might have only one. A wealthy household might use imported cloth. A poorer household might rely on locally produced textiles. A noblewoman could have a servant bring hot water. Another woman might need to heat it herself. The difference between these lives could be enormous. Yet the basic physical problem remained unchanged. Heat was always trying to escape. The human body produced warmth. The winter environment drew it away. Clothing and shelter slowed that process. This is why wool was so valuable. Woolen textiles were not necessarily soft or luxurious by modern standards. Some could feel coarse. Some were heavily woven. Some were rough from repeated use. But their ability to provide warmth made them extremely useful. A wool cloak could protect a person walking outside. A wool blanket could protect someone in bed. Wool could be layered. It could be repaired. It could be reused. And it could remain useful even in damp conditions. In a world where synthetic insulation did not exist, natural fibers were essential. Linen also had an important place in clothing. It was commonly used for undergarments and other textiles. Linen was comfortable against the skin and could be washed more easily than some heavier materials. A person might therefore wear a combination of fabrics, each serving a different purpose. The clothing system was not designed only for warmth. It also needed to manage cleanliness, movement, work, social status, and available resources. Winter simply made the insulating qualities more important. A widow working outdoors had different needs from one spending most of her day indoors. A woman involved in farming needed garments that allowed movement. A woman working in textile production might sit for long periods. A woman managing a household needed practical clothing for domestic work. The medieval world was full of such differences. And perhaps the most interesting part is that people did not necessarily describe them using the language we use today. They were not thinking about thermal conductivity. They were not calculating heat loss. They simply knew that one garment was warmer than another. They knew that a certain blanket was better. They knew which side of the room was coldest. They knew when the wind was dangerous. Experience became knowledge. Knowledge became habit. Habit became survival. The same quiet intelligence could be seen in the preparation of bedding. Straw mattresses required maintenance. Straw could become compressed. It could become damp. It could need replacement. A mattress that had lost its shape was less comfortable and potentially less insulating. So household bedding was not completely passive. It had to be managed. The straw could be refreshed. The bedding could be aired when weather permitted. Textiles could be cleaned and repaired. The sleeping area could be reorganized. These tasks might seem small to us, but in the medieval household, maintenance was a constant part of life. Objects were expected to last. People repaired rather than replaced. A blanket with a damaged edge could be stitched. A cloak could be patched. A mattress could be refilled. A curtain could be repaired. A wooden shutter could be fixed. A roof could be thatched again. This culture of maintenance was especially important during winter. A broken object became more valuable when replacing it was difficult. A small repair made in autumn could prevent a serious problem in January. So the widow's winter preparation might include work that nobody would consider particularly memorable. She might spend an afternoon repairing a blanket. She might check the stitching on a cloak. She might gather dry material for the fire. She might inspect the door. She might ask a neighbor about weather. She might store food. She might move bedding away from a damp wall. Each action was part of a larger pattern. Prepare before the cold becomes severe. Preserve warmth once it has been created. Waste as little as possible, and rely on the household rather than on a single source of comfort. This is why community could matter. A widow did not always live in isolation. Medieval villages and towns were communities of people who depended on one another in many ways. Neighbors could exchange goods. Relatives could provide support. Markets could provide necessities when roads remained open. Parishes and religious institutions could offer charity in some circumstances. The exact level of support varied greatly. Not every widow was protected. Not every community was generous. But social connections could matter enormously. A widow might borrow something. She might trade labor for goods. She might receive assistance from relatives. She might work for another household. She might sell goods she produced. In some places, widows were active participants in local economic life. Winter, therefore, did not isolate everyone completely. The village itself was a network. Smoke rising from several roofs showed that other households were awake. Footsteps might pass along the frozen path. A neighbor might arrive carrying something. A market might still operate when weather allowed. Life continued, even during the longest nights. And perhaps that continuity was comforting. The winter could feel enormous, but it was not endless. The sun would return, the days would lengthen, the snow would melt, the fields would change, the first signs of spring would eventually appear. The widow did not need to defeat the entire winter. She only needed to move through one night at a time, one morning at a time, one bundle of fuel at a time, one meal at a time, one repair at a time. And this slow rhythm could make even a long winter manageable. The night would come again. The house would darken. The fire would glow. The bedding would be prepared. The door would close. the widow would settle down, and the same quiet cycle would begin. Imagine the sound of rain against the roof instead of snow. The night may be wet rather than white. The wind pushes against the walls. Water gathers outside. Inside, the fire burns steadily. The smell of damp wool fills the room. A cloak hangs near the hearth. The widow waits for it to dry. She cannot simply turn up the heat. She must wait. She turns the garment occasionally so that one side does not become too hot. The cloth gradually releases its moisture. Steam may rise faintly. The warmth of the fire is used carefully. Nothing is wasted, even heat. And that may be one of the defining qualities of medieval domestic life. Resources were limited enough that people learned to notice them. A small amount of warmth had value. A dry corner had value. A good blanket had value. A sound roof had value. A warm meal had value. A few extra hours of daylight had value. The modern mind can easily overlook such things because many of us live surrounded by systems designed to provide them automatically. Medieval households did not have that luxury. Warmth had to be produced, protected, moved, shared, and sometimes rationed. For widows, the economic dimension could be particularly important. A woman who controlled property might need to decide how much fuel to purchase. She might have to balance heating against other expenses. Food, rent, clothing, repairs, taxes, and household needs all competed for resources. A wealthy widow could absorb these costs. A poor widow might not. So the question of how medieval widows kept warm is also a question about inequality. Some slept beneath heavy textiles and enclosed beds. Others slept in simple rooms with minimal bedding. Some had abundant fuel. Others depended upon gathered branches or whatever combustible material they could legally obtain. Some had servants. Others performed every task themselves. Some had family nearby. Others lived with little support. There was no single widow's winter. There were many. Yet beneath these differences was a common human experience. The body becomes cold. The instinct is to seek shelter. The hand reaches toward warmth. The blanket is pulled closer. The fire is tended. The door is closed, and the night passes. Perhaps this is why winter appears so often in historical records as a period of hardship. A harsh winter could affect agriculture. Travel could become difficult. Food prices could change. Livestock could suffer. Roads could become dangerous. The poor could be especially vulnerable. But even when winters were difficult, people continued to adapt. They had done so for generations. They knew their local landscape. They knew where fuel could be found. They knew which food stored well. They knew which garments were warmest. They knew which buildings retained heat. Their knowledge was imperfect. Their resources were limited. But their experience was deep. And so, as another evening approaches, the widow begins preparing for the night. The light outside fades. The sky becomes gray. The room grows darker. The last work of the day is finished. The fire is fed. Food is put away. The door is checked. The bedding is arranged. A blanket is shaken and folded. Perhaps the widow pauses for a moment beside the hearth. She watches the flames. The firelight moves across her hands. The sound of burning wood is soft. Outside, the wind touches the walls. She knows that the night will be long, but she also knows what to do. She has done this before, and she will do it again. She will create a small island of warmth. Then she will rest inside it. The winter will remain outside. The cold will press against the walls. The darkness will continue. But inside the blankets, beneath the layers of cloth, the body will slowly warm the space around itself. The fire will leave a faint glow. The house will settle into silence, and the widow will sleep. Hours later, the coldest part of the night will arrive. The fire will be weaker. The air will be colder. The roof will be dark beneath the winter sky. But the bedding will still hold the warmth of the sleeping body. This was the quiet technology of survival, not a machine, not an invention. A collection of simple materials arranged carefully around a human being. Cloth, straw, wood, stone, fire, food, shelter, and the knowledge of how to use them. The medieval widow did not conquer the winter. She learned its rhythm. She learned when to gather, when to burn, when to cover, when to repair, when to rest. And when the morning came, she began again. The first pale light entered through the small opening. The room slowly became visible. The embers waited beneath the ash. The widow rose. She wrapped herself against the cold. Then she went to the hearth. A little fuel, a little air, a little patience. The ember brightened. The flame returned. And once again, warmth entered the house. Outside, the winter remained. But inside, another day had begun. The story would continue. And so would the quiet work of staying warm. The new day begins quietly. The fire has returned, but it is still small. A few pieces of wood rest among the glowing embers, and a thin thread of smoke rises toward the roof. The room is no longer completely dark, yet the winter morning has brought little warmth with it. The widow stands near the hearth for a moment. Her hands are cold. She holds them close to the flame. There is no hurry. The morning will take its time. Outside, the village is beginning to stir. A door opens somewhere nearby. A dog makes a soft sound. Footsteps pass over frozen ground. From another house comes the faint smell of smoke. The village is waking one household at a time. Inside her own home, the widow begins the familiar work of the day. She does not think of warmth as something separate from everything else. It is part of cooking, part of cleaning, part of clothing, part of sleeping, part of work. The fire must remain useful. If she has food to prepare, the morning flame will be used for cooking. If clothing needs drying, it can be placed nearby. If water needs heating, the fire will do that too. A single source of heat serves many purposes. Nothing about the medieval hearth is simple once we look closely. A fire requires fuel. Fuel requires labor. Labor requires time. And time is one of the most valuable things a household possesses. For a widow, especially one managing her own home, every task has to fit into the day. She may have to prepare food. She may have to care for children. She may have to work. She may have to repair clothing. She may have to manage animals. She may have to arrange trade. She may have to maintain the house. Winter does not remove these responsibilities. It makes some of them harder. The cold slows movement. darkness shortens the working day. Wet weather makes outdoor work unpleasant. Snow can make roads difficult. And yet the household continues. Perhaps the widow steps outside for a short time. The air immediately feels different. The warmth of the house is behind her. Cold air touches her face. The ground is stiff beneath her feet. She draws her cloak closer around herself. A cloak was more than a symbol of status. For someone moving outdoors, it was a practical barrier against wind and cold. A loose outer garment could cover much of the body. It could also be adjusted depending on the weather. Wrapped tightly, it reduced exposure. Opened slightly, it allowed movement. The hood, when present, could protect the head and neck. In a world where much body heat could be lost through exposed surfaces, covering the head was sensible. Medieval clothing was often designed around layers. The exact garments changed across centuries and regions. But people understood through experience that several layers could be more useful than one thin garment. The air between layers could provide additional insulation. This is a simple physical principle, but medieval people did not need scientific terminology to use it. They knew what felt warmer. They knew what kept the wind away. They knew what became uncomfortable when wet. And they learned from experience. The widow returns indoors. The warmth of the hearth feels gentle against her face. She removes the outer garment if it has become damp. It is placed where the fire can dry it slowly. Too close, and the cloth could be damaged. Too far, and it might remain damp. Again, there is a balance. The medieval household was full of these small balances. Heat and smoke, dryness and fire, comfort and fuel, warmth and safety. Nothing could be taken for granted. The same careful thinking applied to the walls. A house with gaps around the door could become uncomfortable quickly. The door itself might be made of wood. Its construction varied. Some doors were substantial, others were simple. Curtains or other materials could sometimes help reduce drafts. A small opening might allow a cold stream of air to enter. The household would notice. A person sitting nearby might feel it first. The solution might be simple. A cloth could be placed there. The door could be repaired. A shutter could be adjusted. A crack could be sealed with available materials. The goal was not to make the house airtight. That would not have been practical. The goal was to prevent unnecessary drafts. Air movement could make a room feel colder even when the temperature had not changed dramatically. The wind outside could turn a small opening into a steady stream of cold air. So the medieval house was a negotiation with the weather. The walls resisted, the roof sheltered, the door closed, the fire warmed, the clothing protected, the bedding completed the work at night, and the human body remained at the center of it all. Imagine now that the widow has children. The morning is busier. A child wakes cold. The widow pulls a blanket around the child before returning to the fire. Perhaps another piece of wood is added. Perhaps warm food is prepared. The child sits near the hearth. The room slowly becomes more comfortable. There is no separate heating system for each person. Warmth is shared. The family gathers around the same source. This arrangement was practical. It also shaped social life. The hearth became a natural meeting place. People could sit nearby while working. Someone might repair a tool. Someone else might prepare food. Another person might spin thread. Conversation could continue while the fire burned. During the long winter evenings, these activities helped fill the darkness. A medieval winter night could last for many hours. Without electric lighting, people relied on daylight and small sources of artificial light. Candles existed, but quality and affordability varied. Rushlights and oil lamps were used in different regions and periods. Artificial light consumed resources. A household, therefore, did not necessarily keep every room brightly illuminated. The fire itself became part of the lighting. Its glow extended only a limited distance. Beyond it, shadows remained. This had an unexpected relationship with warmth. People naturally gathered where there was light, and where there was light, there was often heat. The warmest and brightest part of the room became the center of activity. The outer parts of the room could remain darker and cooler. This encouraged people to organize their work close to the hearth. The widow might sit there while sewing. She could mend a garment by firelight. The needle would catch the glow. The thread would move through cloth. The work might continue for a while. Then her eyes would tire. The light would be too weak. She would put the sewing aside. The evening would become quieter. This was not unusual. The darkness itself shaped the rhythm of life. People often rose with daylight and rested when the darkness made work more difficult. Winter nights could therefore feel very long. But they were not necessarily empty. People talked, prayed, worked, ate, rested, and waited for morning. For a widow, winter could also be a season when memories became stronger. The house was quiet. There were fewer outdoor distractions. The darkness seemed to surround the home. The absence of a husband might become more noticeable during the long evenings. Yet widowhood could also bring a new kind of independence. Depending on local law and circumstances, a widow might have rights over property, household goods, or business interests. Some widows became economically active. They could run shops or workshops. They could employ workers. They could participate in trade. They could manage land. Their lives were not limited to the image of a grieving woman sitting silently beside a fire. Medieval women could be practical managers of households and economic resources. The winter itself demanded such competence. A widow who managed property had to think ahead. How much fuel was available? How much food remained? Would repairs be needed before the next storm? Could clothing be replaced? Could she afford to buy additional fuel? Could she obtain help? These questions belong to the everyday economics of survival. And sometimes the answer was not to buy anything at all. People used what they already possessed. Old cloth could be reused. Worn garments could be altered. Blankets could be repaired. Furniture could be moved. Bedding could be rearranged. A family might sleep closer together. The household could adapt without spending money. This ability to adapt was important because medieval economies were often based on a mixture of money, goods, labor, and local exchange. Not everyone could simply purchase whatever they needed. A person might trade eggs for something else. Labor might be exchanged for assistance. A widow might produce textiles or food to sell. A household could depend on several small sources of income rather than one modern-style wage. Winter tested all of them. Imagine a week of unusually cold weather. The temperature remains low. The fire consumes fuel quickly. The widow notices that the woodpile is becoming smaller. She begins using smaller pieces. She keeps the fire concentrated. She avoids wasting fuel when no one needs to be near the hearth. The room is allowed to become cooler during certain parts of the day. This might sound uncomfortable. It was. But medieval people were accustomed to living at temperatures that modern people might find unpleasant. Comfort is partly a matter of expectation. Someone who has spent their entire life moving between heated rooms may experience a cold chamber as intolerable. Someone accustomed to cold interiors may consider the same temperature ordinary. That does not mean medieval people did not suffer from cold. They certainly could. Hypothermia, frostbite, and cold-related illness were real dangers. The poor were particularly vulnerable. People without adequate food, clothing, shelter, or fuel faced serious risks during severe weather. But much of daily life was organized around reducing those risks. The body needed energy. The house needed protection. The fire needed fuel. The clothing needed maintenance. And the household needed planning. The widow might therefore become an expert in small economies. One log can be used for cooking. Another can be saved for the evening. A bundle of smaller sticks can restart the fire. A thicker piece can keep it alive longer. Ash can help preserve embers. The details depend on local practice and fuel, but the basic idea is universal. A fire is easier to maintain when it is managed rather than constantly rebuilt. The same is true of warmth itself. Once the body is warm, it is easier to stay warm than to become warm again from a cold state. This is why clothing mattered so much. If the widow went outdoors while already warm and properly dressed, she could preserve more of that warmth. If she became thoroughly chilled, returning to comfort would take longer. So preparation before going outside was important. A cloak, a hood, dry footwear, layered clothing. Perhaps gloves or other hand coverings. The exact garments varied, but the principle remained. Do not allow the cold to reach the body too easily. The hands could be especially vulnerable. They were exposed during work. They touched cold objects. They could become numb. The widow might tuck her hands into her sleeves when walking. She might hold them near the fire afterward. Small actions again. No single action was enough. Together, they helped. Now imagine the house at midday. The sun is low. Even if the sky is clear, the winter light is weak. The fire is still burning. The widow prepares a meal. Perhaps a thick pot of grain and vegetables. Perhaps a simple soup. Perhaps bread and something preserved. The food is not merely fuel for the body. It is part of the household's winter strategy. A warm meal changes how cold feels. The heat of food provides immediate comfort. The energy it supplies helps the body maintain its temperature. A well-fed person is better prepared to endure cold than someone who is hungry. This is one reason food shortages could become so dangerous in winter. Cold increases the importance of adequate nutrition. And winter was also the season when food stores had to last. The widow could not simply assume that more would appear tomorrow. She had to think about the future. A generous meal today might leave less food for later. A very small meal might leave the household weak. Again, balance. The same word returns. Balance. Medieval life often required it. Use enough. Do not waste. Save enough. Do not starve. Burn enough. Do not exhaust the fuel. Stay warm. Do not create a fire hazard. Repair enough. Do not spend more than the household can afford. This was practical intelligence, and it was often invisible. The chronicles rarely describe it. Yet without such decisions, households could not function. A widow might also use the architecture of the house to her advantage. Rooms differed in warmth. A chamber close to the hearth could be more comfortable. A room with fewer external walls might lose less heat. A low ceiling could help retain warmth. A smaller room could warm more easily than a large hall. In some houses, animals were kept close to human living spaces. This was partly practical. Animals needed protection. People needed protection. The arrangement could also contribute some warmth. But medieval people did not necessarily live with animals in every house or every room. Building traditions varied widely. In some rural homes, livestock occupied adjacent spaces. In others, they were separated. The exact arrangement depended on climate, architecture, local customs, and wealth. Still, the broader idea is important. People used the whole household environment to their advantage. They placed things where they made sense. They worked where it was warmest. They slept where shelter was strongest. They kept fuel where it would remain dry. They stored food where it would survive. The home became a system, and the widow was often one of the people responsible for keeping that system working. As afternoon fades, the winter light begins disappearing again. The same day that began with darkness now moves toward another darkness. The widow checks the fuel. Perhaps there is enough. Perhaps she will need more tomorrow. She looks at the sky. Clouds are moving in. The wind is becoming stronger. A cold night may be coming. She prepares early. This is another quiet lesson of winter. Preparation before sunset. Once darkness arrives, every task becomes more difficult. Firewood is harder to gather. Repairs are harder to see. Travel becomes more dangerous. So the household completes what it can while there is still light. The final pieces of work are finished. Clothing is brought inside. Doors are checked. Food is prepared. The hearth is strengthened. The bedding is arranged. Then the evening begins. A small meal is shared. The room is lit by firelight. The flames move gently. Shadows shift across the walls. The smell of smoke mingles with the smell of food. Someone may speak quietly. Someone may work. Someone may simply sit. The widow listens. Outside, the wind moves across the roof. Perhaps snow begins falling again. Perhaps rain taps softly. Perhaps the sky is clear and filled with stars. Whatever the weather, the house is now closed against it. The night is long, but the household knows how to enter it. The fire becomes the center. The bedding becomes the refuge. The clothing becomes the outer shell. The walls become the barrier, and the people inside become one another's company. This was how warmth was created, not only through heat, through shelter, through habit, through preparation, through community, and through patience. The widow does not expect the night to become summer. She simply makes the cold manageable. She places another piece of wood onto the fire. The flames rise. For a moment, the room becomes brighter. Then they settle. The fire burns quietly. The widow pulls her blanket closer. The longest winter nights continue. But they do not last forever. Beyond the dark roof, the stars move slowly across the sky. The hours pass. The fire becomes smaller. The house becomes quiet. And beneath the layers of bedding, the widow remains sheltered. Her body provides the warmth. The bedding keeps it close. The walls keep the wind away. The remaining embers guard the darkness. Nothing is perfect, but enough is enough. And sometime before dawn, the woman sleeps deeply. The night moves on. The winter moves on. And when morning returns, the first thing she will do is not wonder how to defeat the cold. She will simply begin the familiar work again. A little fuel, a little fire, a little warmth, a new day, and another quiet step through winter. The morning comes slowly. There is no sudden brightness. The winter sky remains pale and gray, and the light enters the house almost reluctantly. The widow wakes beneath her bedding. For a few moments, she remains still. The warmth beneath the blankets is precious. Outside that small space, the room is cold again. She can feel it on her face. The air around her is much colder than the air trapped beneath the blankets. This small difference explains much about medieval sleeping habits. People did not necessarily need to warm the entire room. They needed to preserve the warmth immediately around the body. The blanket did much of this work. The mattress did another part. The clothing provided another layer, and the walls kept the worst of the wind outside. Eventually, she must leave the bed. She sits up slowly. The bedding falls around her shoulders. For a moment, she remains wrapped in it. Then she reaches for her clothing. The garments may have been placed nearby the night before. Cold clothing is unpleasant against warm skin. If possible, she may bring part of it closer to the hearth. A little warmth makes dressing easier. This was not a luxury. It was simply sensible. Clothing that is warm and dry feels very different from clothing that is cold and damp. The widow dresses in layers. The first layer touches the body. Another goes over it. Then, perhaps a heavier woolen garment. If she needs to go outside, an outer cloak will provide further protection. The process takes time. But the clothing is now part of her shelter. She is no longer surrounded by blankets. Instead, she carries her warmth with her. She moves toward the hearth. The embers are still alive. This is important. A fire that can be revived from embers saves time and fuel. The widow gently moves the ash. The red glow becomes visible. She adds small, dry pieces of fuel. The fire catches. A tiny flame becomes a larger one. The room slowly begins to change. The darkness retreats. The hearth brightens. The cold remains. But it is no longer the only sensation. She holds her hands near the flame. The warmth reaches her fingers first, then her palms, then the front of her clothing. The moment is simple. Yet for someone living through a long winter, it would be familiar. Every morning begins with the same quiet negotiation. The cold says, "Remain still." The day says, "Rise." The fire helps make rising possible. Outside, the village is becoming active. Smoke rises from rooftops. People begin their work. Someone may carry a bucket. Someone may lead animals. Someone may walk toward a market or workshop. The winter does not stop ordinary life. It changes the way ordinary life is performed. Work must happen while staying as warm as possible. Hands need to remain functional. Feet need protection. Clothing must allow movement. The widow may spend part of the day indoors. If she works with textiles, the cold affects her fingers. Spinning requires controlled movement. Sewing requires sensitivity in the hands. Cold fingers become stiff, so she may sit close to the hearth. The fire provides both light and warmth. She places the work where she can see it. The thread passes through her fingers. The spindle turns. The task is repetitive, quiet, almost meditative. Outside, the wind moves through the village. Inside, the rhythm continues. This kind of work was especially suited to long evenings. Textile production was an important part of medieval household economies. Women spun yarn. They wove. They sewed. They repaired. They produced clothing and household textiles. Some worked for their own households. Others produced goods for sale. Widows could participate in these activities as workers, craftswomen, or business managers, depending on their circumstances. And winter could actually increase the amount of time spent on certain indoor crafts. When fields were quiet and daylight was short, household work became more central. The fire became the center of the working world. Imagine the soft sound of wool being handled, the faint movement of the spindle, the occasional crack of burning wood. There is no machinery, no clock announcing the next task. The day moves according to light, weather, hunger, and household needs. The widow may glance toward the doorway. A thin line of cold air enters around its edge. She notices. Perhaps she places a folded cloth against the gap. It is not a permanent repair, but it reduces the draft. This is another example of medieval adaptation. People did not always solve problems permanently. Sometimes they solved them for the night. A cloth could block a draft until a better repair became possible. A blanket could cover a damaged opening. A board could serve as a temporary shutter. A piece of leather could reinforce worn material. Improvisation was part of ordinary life. The house did not have to be perfect. It only had to protect its inhabitants well enough. The widow returns to her work. The fire burns. The room becomes warmer. Hours pass. By midday, the winter sun may briefly appear. If the weather is dry, this is an opportunity. Clothing can be aired. Bedding can be moved. A damp textile can be placed where sunlight reaches it. Sunlight is weak in winter, but it is free. People made use of whatever natural warmth was available. A wall facing the sun could become slightly warmer. A sheltered corner could protect a person from wind. A sunny outdoor area could provide a brief break from the cold. The medieval world was full of such small observations. People watched the movement of the sun. They noticed which side of a building stayed dry. They learned where snow remained longest. They knew which paths became muddy first. This knowledge was practical. It was tied to survival. For the widow, understanding her house was almost as important as owning it. She knew where the wind entered. She knew which room was warmer. She knew where to store the fuel. She knew which wall became damp. She knew which blanket was thickest. She knew which clothing dried fastest. A house was not simply a building. It was an environment she understood through daily experience. And this becomes especially important when we consider poverty. A poor widow could not simply buy a better house. She might not be able to purchase more fuel. She might not have several blankets. Her options were narrower. For her, small differences mattered enormously. A repaired cloak could mean another winter of protection. A dry bundle of fuel could mean several warm evenings. A sound pair of shoes could keep her feet dry. A neighbor's help could make a difficult week manageable. A bowl of warm food could restore strength. The history of winter is therefore also a history of unequal vulnerability. The same cold could be much more dangerous for someone with few resources. This is why medieval charity sometimes became important. Religious institutions, communities, and individuals could provide assistance to people in need. Monasteries, churches, charitable foundations, and wealthy households could sometimes distribute food or other necessities. The exact forms of assistance varied widely. Charity was not guaranteed. It could be seasonal. It could be conditional. It could be inadequate. But it existed as part of medieval social life. A widow without enough fuel might sometimes receive help. A widow without food might seek assistance. A poor household might depend upon community relationships. These systems were imperfect. Still, they formed another layer of protection. Not every winter night was faced alone. Sometimes, the warmth came from another person's generosity. Sometimes it came from family. Sometimes from neighbors. Sometimes from the wider community. And sometimes, unfortunately, there was no help. That is an important part of the story, too. Medieval winter could be genuinely dangerous. The romantic image of snow falling quietly over a village can hide the hardship underneath. Cold could damage crops. Animals could die. Roads could become impassable. Food could become expensive. People could become sick. Those with poor shelter could suffer greatly. A widow with no property and little support could be particularly exposed. Yet history should not reduce these women to helpless victims. Many were capable managers. They adapted. They worked. They negotiated. They repaired. They traded. They relied on networks. They made decisions. They found ways to continue. The winter did not define them completely. It was one condition among many, and the ability to respond to it was part of their everyday skill. By late afternoon, the light begins to disappear again. The widow knows the evening is approaching. She checks the hearth. The fire is still useful. She begins preparing the evening meal. The pot is placed near the heat. The smell of food gradually fills the room. Warmth spreads through the air. Steam rises. The room feels different. The meal will provide warmth in two ways. First, the cooking process adds heat to the immediate environment. Second, the food will provide energy to the body. The difference may seem small, but during winter, small things accumulate. The widow eats. Her hands rest around the warm vessel. The heat travels into her fingers. For a moment, she does nothing. She simply feels the warmth. Then she continues. The evening meal ends. The pot is moved. The dishes are cleaned. The fire is adjusted. The house becomes quiet again. The longest part of the day is approaching. Night. In a medieval village, winter darkness could transform the appearance of everything. The familiar path outside becomes uncertain. The fields disappear. The trees become silhouettes. The house becomes a small island of light. Inside, the firelight moves across the walls. The widow closes the shutters, if the house has them. The wind becomes less visible, but more noticeable. It moves around the structure. The roof creaks. The fire crackles. The household settles. This is when bedding becomes especially important. A bed could be layered from bottom to top. The structure itself might be wooden. The mattress might contain straw or other filling. Sheets or other textiles could lie over it. Blankets could cover the sleeper. A quilted or padded covering might exist in wealthier circumstances. The exact arrangement depended on time, place, and social status. But every layer had a purpose. The mattress separated the body from the cold beneath. The bedding reduced heat loss above. The surrounding structure reduced drafts. The body warmed the enclosed space. The result was far more comfortable than sleeping directly on a cold floor. The widow climbs into bed. She draws the blanket around herself. The fire is still visible from where she lies. The flames have become smaller. The room is darker. But she is protected. This is one of the most important things to understand about medieval warmth. Protection did not mean eliminating cold. It meant reducing exposure. A person could remain safe enough while the surrounding environment remained cold. The same principle is still used today. We wear coats. We use sleeping bags. We build insulated rooms. We close doors. The technology has changed. The basic idea has not. Keep the heat close. Keep the cold outside. As the night deepens, the widow becomes aware of small sounds. The fire, the wind, perhaps rain, perhaps the faint movement of an animal, perhaps someone breathing nearby. If she shares the room, the presence of other people changes the atmosphere. The room is not silent. It is inhabited. Several bodies occupy the same sheltered space. Their combined warmth helps. This was especially useful in small dwellings. Sleeping arrangements could bring people close together. There was less emphasis on individual bedrooms. Privacy as we understand it today was not the same. The household shared space, and in winter, shared space had a physical advantage. Warmth was shared too. A child might sleep beside a parent. Relatives might occupy the same room. Servants might sleep nearby. Different arrangements existed according to household type and social status. But the principle was familiar. A smaller enclosed space occupied by several people could feel warmer than a large empty room. The widow pulls the blanket slightly higher. Her breath is warm. The cloth near her face becomes warmer. Her body is creating its own little environment. Outside, the temperature continues to fall. Inside the bedding, the difference is enough. The night continues. Perhaps she wakes once. The fire has almost disappeared. She listens. Nothing seems wrong. The house is secure. She does not need to rise. She pulls the blanket closer. Then she sleeps again. This is important because medieval people did not necessarily experience sleep as one uninterrupted modern block. Nighttime awakenings were common in many historical societies. People might wake naturally during the night. They could pray, talk, check the fire, use the chamber pot, attend to a child, then return to sleep. The long winter night could therefore contain several periods of waking and sleeping. For a widow alone, these moments could feel very quiet. The darkness outside was immense, but the house remained familiar. She knew every sound, every creak, every movement of the fire, every corner of the room. Familiarity itself could create a sense of security. Then, slowly, the night moves toward morning. The darkness becomes lighter. The cold remains. The fire is nearly gone. The widow wakes again. She does not want to leave the bedding. But the day requires her. She sits up. The blanket stays around her shoulders. She reaches for the clothing. The same process begins again. And here, the rhythm becomes clear. Winter was not survived through one heroic effort. It was survived through repetition. Every day required preparation. Every evening required fuel. Every night required bedding. Every morning required a new fire. Every garment needed care. Every roof needed maintenance. Every meal mattered. The winter was a long series of small tasks, and for a widow, these tasks could become part of a new life. Widowhood itself often required adjustment. The death of a husband could change household finances. Property arrangements could change. Responsibilities could change. Work could change. A woman who had once depended upon a husband for certain tasks might now need to perform or arrange them herself. This could include securing fuel, managing servants, negotiating with merchants, handling animals, maintaining property. The exact experience depended upon her social position, but winter could make those responsibilities impossible to ignore. A cold house does not care who is responsible for it. Someone must find the fuel. Someone must repair the roof. Someone must prepare the meal. Someone must protect the children. Someone must maintain the fire. The widow might become that person. And through these tasks, her role in the household could become stronger. She might know more about the practical operation of the home than anyone else. She might know the exact amount of fuel remaining. She might know which wall needed repair. She might know which textile could be salvaged. She might know which neighbor could provide assistance. This kind of knowledge rarely appears in official records, yet it shaped daily life. The winter morning continues. A new fire burns. The widow places a pot near it. She opens the door briefly. Cold air enters. Then she closes it again. The contrast is immediate. Outside is winter. Inside is home. The door separates two worlds. She returns to the hearth. The fire is stronger now. The room brightens. Perhaps the smell of bread begins to rise. Perhaps water warms. Perhaps the household starts talking. The day has begun, and with it comes another opportunity to gather warmth. Later, if the weather allows, she may step outside. The sun has risen higher. Its light is pale but pleasant. She stands in a sheltered place. The sunlight touches her face. For a moment, she feels warmer. She may turn toward it. This simple act would have been familiar to people living in cold climates. Sunlight is one of the oldest sources of warmth. People naturally seek it. Walls, courtyards, doorways, and south-facing spaces could become useful places to escape the wind. A sunny wall might feel warmer than an exposed path. A sheltered courtyard might offer protection. Architecture and weather were always connected. People learned where to stand, where to work, where to rest, where to place a chair, where to dry cloth, where to keep animals. The widow's understanding of the house and its surroundings was part of her survival. And so the day passes. Work continues. The fire burns. The winter landscape remains. But something has changed. The widow is no longer simply waiting for winter to end. She is living through it. This distinction matters. People in the medieval world did not spend every winter day thinking only about survival. They lived ordinary lives. They laughed. They worked. They argued. They prayed. They cared for children. They visited neighbors. They traded goods. They made plans. They celebrated religious festivals. They repaired things. They told stories. Winter was difficult, but it was also part of the normal calendar. The long nights belonged to life. And within those long nights, warmth could be found. Sometimes in the hearth, sometimes in a blanket, sometimes in a warm meal, sometimes in another person's presence, sometimes simply in knowing that morning would come. The widow knows this. She has watched enough winters to understand the rhythm. Even when the night is long, it ends. Even when the fire becomes low, it can be revived. Even when a garment becomes worn, it may be repaired. Even when the weather is harsh, there will eventually be a change. The seasons do not remain still. Winter moves, slowly, quietly, but it moves. And as evening approaches once more, the widow begins preparing the house. The fire is strengthened. The blankets are checked. The door is secured. The room becomes quieter. Outside, frost begins forming on the ground. The sky turns dark. The longest winter night is approaching again. She sits near the hearth. Her hands are warm now. The work of the day is finished. She listens to the fire. The flames rise and fall. A log breaks softly. The room glows. The cold presses against the walls. But the walls hold. The bedding waits. The food stores remain. The clothing is ready. The household is prepared. She does not need to think about the entire winter. Only this night. Only these few hours. Only this small circle of warmth. She moves toward the bed. The fire remains behind her. She settles beneath the blankets. The cloth surrounds her. Her body slowly warms the space. The room becomes still. Outside, the wind passes over the frozen fields. The trees move gently. The village grows quiet. And inside the small medieval home, the widow closes her eyes. The night is long, but she has learned how to live inside it. Not by making the winter disappear, not by forcing the world to become warm, but by creating warmth wherever she can. In the fire, in the clothing, in the bedding, in the walls, in the food, in the company of others, and in the quiet knowledge that dawn will come again. The fire continues to glow. The winter continues outside, and beneath the blanket, the widow sleeps. The night is quiet now. The fire has settled into a bed of glowing embers, and the room is darker than it was earlier in the evening. The widow lies beneath her blankets. Outside, winter has covered the village in silence. Perhaps snow rests along the roof. Perhaps rain moves softly through the darkness. Perhaps a cold wind passes between the houses. Whatever the weather, the night has become part of the house. It touches the walls. It presses against the door. It moves through small openings. But it cannot reach the widow as easily as it reaches the open fields. The house stands between her and the winter. The bedding stands between her and the cold room. Her clothing stands between her skin and the air. And the warmth produced by her own body remains close. This simple arrangement has carried her through many nights. It is easy to imagine medieval warmth as something primitive and inadequate, and by modern standards, much of it certainly was. There was no central heating. There were no insulated windows as we know them. There were no electric blankets. There were no thermostats. But the absence of modern technology does not mean the absence of knowledge. Medieval people understood their environment through experience. They knew which materials were warm. They knew which buildings held heat. They knew how to manage fires. They knew that damp clothing was dangerous in cold weather. They knew that food mattered. They knew that blankets mattered. They knew that wind could make a mild day feel bitter. They knew that preparation mattered most before winter became severe. And widows, like everyone else, lived within this accumulated knowledge. Some had more resources than others. Some had almost none. But each household created its own strategy. A noble widow might sleep in a large chamber, protected by thick walls, heavy curtains, several layers of bedding, and servants who maintained the fires. A merchant's widow might live in a townhouse where the lower floors were partly protected by surrounding buildings. A rural widow might live in a smaller house where the hearth stood at the center of daily life. A poor widow might have only simple bedding and limited fuel. The experiences were different, yet all of them were trying to accomplish the same physical task: keep enough heat close to the body. That is the quiet answer at the center of this story. Medieval widows did not keep warm through one remarkable invention. They used layers, layers of clothing, layers of bedding, layers of shelter, layers of daily habits. And these layers worked together. A wool garment reduced heat loss. A blanket reduced it further. A mattress separated the body from a cold surface. A wall reduced exposure to wind. A shutter reduced drafts. A fire warmed the room. A warm meal supplied energy. Another person nearby could provide additional warmth. No single method was perfect. Together, they could make a cold night bearable. The widow wakes briefly. She opens her eyes. The room is almost completely dark. For a moment, she listens. The fire makes a faint sound. A piece of wood shifts. There is a soft movement somewhere beyond the room. She knows the house. She knows that nothing is wrong. She pulls the blanket closer. Then she closes her eyes again. The moment passes. This is perhaps what the longest winter nights were really like. Not constant drama, not constant suffering, but long periods of quiet. The cold was always present. Yet life continued around it. People learned not to notice every sensation. They adapted. A cold floor was simply a cold floor. A draft was something to block. A fire needed attention. A blanket needed repair. Winter was not an unusual interruption. It was one of the seasons through which life moved. And that understanding helps us see medieval widows more clearly. They were not simply women waiting for spring. They were workers, managers, mothers, daughters, neighbors, craftswomen, landholders, merchants, farmers, household heads. The word widow described a change in marital status. It did not describe an entire personality. Some women were grieving, some were relieved, some were anxious, some were independent, some remarried, some did not. Some had comfortable lives, some struggled. Their experiences were as varied as the communities in which they lived. Winter was simply one part of those lives. For men and women, widowhood meant taking greater responsibility for practical decisions. If a husband had previously managed certain household matters, those responsibilities might now fall to the widow. She might need to negotiate. She might need to hire labor. She might need to manage property. She might need to arrange fuel. She might need to oversee food stores. This could be difficult, but it could also demonstrate the competence women possessed and exercised within medieval society. The household was an economic unit. Keeping it warm was part of keeping it functioning. A cold household could not work comfortably. A hungry household could not work effectively. A damaged roof could endanger everything beneath it. A lack of fuel could make cooking difficult. So warmth was connected to the wider health of the household. This is why the preparation for winter mattered so much. The work began before the nights became their longest. Fuel was gathered, food was stored, clothing was repaired, roofs were maintained, walls were checked, bedding was prepared. The household entered winter, carrying the results of months of preparation. Imagine the widow looking at the stores near the beginning of winter. A pile of fuel, a stack of grain, some preserved foods, clothing hanging in its place, blankets folded, tools ready. The amount may not be generous, but it is what she has. She knows that everything must last. The winter will take its share. The fire will consume wood. Meals will consume food. Clothing will wear. Bedding will become compressed. But careful use can stretch resources. This was one of the great skills of household management. Make something last longer than expected. A garment could be repaired instead of replaced. A blanket could be patched. A pot could be repaired. A piece of furniture could be strengthened. A broken tool could be reused. Nothing valuable was easily discarded. In a world where manufacturing was slow and expensive, repair was not an occasional activity. It was part of life. And winter made repair even more important. A small tear in a cloak might seem unimportant in summer. In winter, wind could pass through it. A small gap in a wall could become a constant draft. A missing roof tile could allow rain into the sleeping area. A damaged shutter could let cold air inside. The smallest weaknesses could become noticeable. The widow would therefore pay attention to her surroundings. The house itself became something she listened to. A new sound from the roof, a creak from a door, water dripping where it should not, smoke behaving differently. These signs could indicate problems. The medieval home required observation. The people who lived inside understood its behavior. This is especially true of the hearth. Smoke was part of life. Medieval fireplaces did not always work like modern chimneys. Some houses had open hearths, Others had different arrangements. Smoke might escape through openings in the roof or through chimneys, depending on the building and period. Ventilation mattered. A fire that produced too much smoke could make the room unpleasant. A poorly managed hearth could create serious risks. So the widow needed to know how her particular hearth behaved. She learned how much fuel to use. She learned where to place the wood. She learned how to revive the embers. She learned how to reduce the fire when necessary. This knowledge could become almost automatic. She did not need to explain it. Her hands knew. And perhaps that is one of the most beautiful things about ordinary historical life. People often carried enormous amounts of knowledge without writing it down. They knew how to make bread, how to preserve food, how to spin wool, how to mend clothing, how to tend animals, how to manage fire, how to read weather, how to prepare for winter. Their knowledge was stored in practice. It passed from person to person. A child watched an adult. A young woman learned from an older woman. A new wife learned the habits of her household. A widow who had spent decades managing a home possessed a lifetime of practical knowledge. That knowledge could be more valuable than any written manual. Now imagine the final winter night of the season. We cannot know exactly when a medieval person recognized that winter was ending. There was no modern weather forecast announcing the change, but signs appeared gradually. The days lengthened. The sun climbed higher, ice softened, snow began disappearing. Birds returned. The soil changed. The air felt different. The winter darkness slowly weakened. The widow might notice that the fire no longer needed to burn quite as strongly during the afternoon. She might spend more time outside. Clothing might become lighter. The house might be opened more often. The bedding could be aired. The rhythm of the household would change. Nothing happens all at once. Winter loosens its grip gradually. And perhaps one morning, after months of cold, the widow opens the door. The air is still cool, but it no longer feels endless. The sunlight is stronger. The ground is beginning to soften. She stands outside for a moment. The house behind her is still warm. The hearth still burns. But now the world beyond the door is beginning to offer warmth of its own. The sun reaches her face. She does not need to move immediately. She simply stands there. After months of cold darkness, the light feels different. The season is turning. The longest nights have passed. And perhaps this is the final lesson of the medieval winter. People did not survive it by being fearless. They survived by preparing. They survived by adapting. They survived through material knowledge, household routines, family connections, community support, and simple technologies that had been refined through generations. For widows, this could require particular strength. Not necessarily the loud kind of strength found in stories of battles and rulers. A quieter strength. The strength to rise on a cold morning, to rebuild a fire, to repair a garment, to stretch a food supply, to protect a child, to manage a household, to face another night, and then another. The strength to continue. That kind of strength rarely appears in medieval chronicles. There are no grand monuments dedicated to the woman who repaired her blanket beside the hearth. No statue records the widow who saved enough fuel to make it through February. No royal manuscript describes the careful way she arranged her bedding. Yet these actions were part of the foundation of medieval life. History was not only made in castles and battlefields, it was also made in kitchens, in workshops, in small houses, beside hearths, under blankets, during ordinary nights. A widow closing a wooden door against the winter wind was participating in the same long human story of adaptation that connects us to the past. The materials have changed. The technology has changed. The expectations of comfort have changed. But the basic human need remains. When the world outside is cold, we seek warmth. We close the door. We wrap ourselves in something soft. We gather around a fire. We share food. We move closer to those we love. We wait for morning. The medieval widow did the same. Her fire may have been smaller. Her blankets may have been rougher. Her house may have been colder. But her desire for warmth was no different. And so, as we return to that quiet house, the winter night is almost over. The fire has become very small. The widow sleeps. Her breathing is steady. The blankets rise gently with each breath. Outside, the final hours of darkness move across the fields. The stars begin to fade. The horizon becomes slightly lighter. A bird makes the first quiet sound of morning. Then another. The village remains still. Soon doors will open. Fires will be revived. Water will be carried. Food will be prepared. Work will begin. But for this brief moment, everything is quiet. The widow is still asleep. The house has protected her through another night. The walls have held. The bedding has held. The fire has lasted. And the cold has remained outside. As the morning slowly arrives, a faint gray light enters the room. The widow wakes. She does not immediately rise. She listens. The world sounds different. There is less wind. The night has softened. She draws the blanket around herself one final time. Then she sits up. Her feet touch the floor. It is cold. She reaches for her clothing. She dresses. She walks toward the hearth. The embers are almost gone, but one small red glow remains. She kneels beside it. A few dry pieces of fuel are placed carefully over the embers. She breathes gently toward the coals. The red becomes brighter. A small flame appears. It grows. The room begins to brighten. And once again, warmth begins with something very small. A single ember, a little fuel, a little air, a little patience. The same things that carried her through the winter. She stands. The fire grows stronger. The morning light enters beside it. For a moment, firelight and daylight exist together. Then the sun rises higher. The house no longer depends entirely on the hearth. The day has arrived. The widow opens the door. Cold air enters. But now it feels different. The winter is still there. Yet it is no longer the endless darkness of midwinter. The sun has returned. The days will continue growing longer. The earth will eventually soften. The fields will become green again. The work of spring will begin. And the long winter nights will become memories. Perhaps another winter will come. Perhaps many more. But for now, the widow steps into the morning. Behind her, the fire continues burning. Inside the house are the blankets that protected her, the repaired garments, the stored objects. the simple bed, the hearth, all the ordinary things that helped make a home. She knows their value. She is dependent upon them. And somewhere in the quiet routine of her life, the winter has taught her again that warmth does not always come from a large fire. Sometimes it comes from a thick wall, sometimes from wool, sometimes from straw, sometimes from food, sometimes from another person's presence, sometimes from preparation, and sometimes from the smallest ember waiting beneath the ash. That ember is enough. Enough to begin. Enough to continue. Enough to carry the household from one cold night toward another morning. And perhaps that is how many medieval widows endured the longest winter nights. Not by escaping the cold, not by making the winter disappear, but by building, day after day and night after night, a small protected world around themselves. A world of cloth and fire, of food and shelter, of repair and patience, of memory and routine. A world where the winter wind could be heard outside, while inside there remained a little warmth. The night passes, the morning comes, and the story of winter becomes part of the quiet rhythm of life. The widow looks toward the rising sun. She takes a slow breath. The new day has begun. And somewhere behind her, the hearth burns softly. For another season, it has done its work. And for another season, she has done hers. She has kept the fire alive. She has kept the household together. She has kept herself warm. And now, with the morning light spreading across the fields, she walks forward into another day. The cold will eventually fade. The snow will disappear. The grass will return. The nights will become shorter. But the memory of the long winter will remain in the simple objects around her, in the woolen blanket, in the repaired cloak, in the worn wooden hearth, in the straw mattress, in the small pile of firewood, in the walls that kept out the wind. These objects may seem ordinary, yet together they tell a story of people who lived without modern comfort but were not without ingenuity. A story of women who managed households through changing seasons. A story of widows who faced uncertainty and continued their daily work. And above all, a story of warmth. Not perfect warmth, not abundant warmth. Just enough warmth. Enough to sleep. Enough to rise. Enough to work. Enough to make another meal. Enough to wait for spring. The sun climbs higher. The village becomes louder. The first smoke of the morning rises into the brightening sky. The widow closes the door behind her. Inside, the fire remains. Outside, the world is waking. And the longest winter night is finally behind her.